an IRB basically looks at, okay, is it, what's the beneficence of this project? Does it promote equity? Does it not do any harm? Right? Those are basically evaluated on these axes. I think it's equity, I think it's justice, respect for personhood, and beneficence is the three prongs they use. I forget, I took it about, but the point being is that they look at these attributes for these and basically out and say, hey, we want to look at if experiments do these harms, or do they promote things. But back before the 70s, when these standards were implemented by federally, was kind of the Wild West. And part of the reason but we can squarely lay the blame for the fact that basically that we need IRB boards, that we need ethics reviews on experiments. We can squarely lay that blame on the Nazis. No joke. And that's where actually our story is going to start, which is with the Nazis, specifically Nazi Germany and the fall of Nazi Germany in post-1945. So for those of you who are interested, by the way, if you want to learn more about actual Nazi Germany in a very verbose kind of way, I highly recommend Richard J. Evans' Third Reich trilogy. He's an eminent historian. Richard J. Evans, Third Reich. It's huge, but it's really informative, really informative. Split into 3 books. I find the second one, which is the pre-war period of the Third Reich, most fascinating. There's parts about what kind of humor was used in the Third Reich for people to try to deal with their situations. And the one that speaks that sticks with me the most is basically he notes how a doctor was writing down the dreams of her patients. And the dreams included basically being constantly wiretapped in their phone conversations, or that their buildings had no walls on the outside, so that they were always under surveillance, that they couldn't escape a totalitarian system even in their sleep. Some deep stuff. Some dark stuff, but this is a very good book. Specifically, though, we are going to be looking at the story that I want to tell starts with a specific Nazi, and his name is Adolf Eichmann. For those of you who don't know, he was one of the architects of the final solution to the Jewish question in Europe, meaning the Holocaust. Basically saying, hey, how should we get rid of all the Jews? And basically he coordinated a whole lot of the deportations of Jews from ghettos to the extermination camps and concentration camps. The post-World War II, though, he escaped. A number of Nazis escaped. Most notably among them, Joseph Mengele escaped. Number of them escaped to South America. Specifically, Adolf Eichmann escaped into Argentina, where he stayed there until the 1960s. Now, Adolf Eichmann was one of many Nazis who were being essentially researched and investigated by Nazi hunters, people who made it their life work to track down these people. And so when Israel got intelligence that basically said, hey, this guy's Adolf Eichmann and he's living under this identity, basically Israel was like, well, we could ask politely for Argentina to extradite him, but we really don't trust Argentina. Or we could go in and extradite him ourselves, but we'd be violating another country's sovereignty there, and that cause a whole foreign relation hoopla. This is a thing that states sometimes have to deal with, most notably with the United States and Osama bin Laden, when Osama bin Laden was in Pakistan, right? The president at the time had to make a choice. Do we alert? That was Obama. Do we alert Pakistan and ask them to extradite him, but we don't really trust necessarily the Pakistanis to, or the Pakistan governments to not accidentally tip Osama bin Laden off? Or do we send in our troops and violate this country's sovereignty and cause a bit of a foreign relation kind of mess? Well, the debates of those can be settled in another class. But what happened is that Israel sent Mossad to Argentina. They extradited him and put him on trial in Germany. Now you may be wondering, why am I talking about this as a computer science class? Okay, and the answer is because I want to talk about this guy, Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram is known for his experiments on obedience, for the Milgram experiment, for the other well-known experiment, see the small world network. So we'll get there. You see, Stanley Milgram was a psychologist, and he's famous for one very large experiment, which is the Milgram obedience experiment. I mean, he did another experiment, which was the small world experiment, and that's the one we're interested in. But I can't talk about Stanley Milgram without talking about the Milgram obedience experiment. And I can't talk about the Milgram obedience experiment without talking about the Nazis, because that's how he got inspired about that. Milgram was influenced by the advance of the Holocaust, especially the trial of Adolf Eichmann, which was televised from Jerusalem, in developing the experiment. One of the common refrains that you have heard that you personally have heard, that that Nazi officers gave for their actions was, "I was just following orders." You've heard that one. And so Milgram was like, so do people actually just follow orders, or is that like, was that unique to Germans, or would Americans do the same thing? And so what he did is he set up this infamous experiment called the Milgram Experiment. There were three people involved in it: the experimenter, the teacher, and the learner. So the experimenter basically was an actor who took on the role, or he was one of the people leading the experiment, but he took on the role of basically directing the experiment and giving instructions to the two participants, the teacher and the learner. Now, so of these two participants, the learner was actually not a real participant. He was a collaborator. He was in on this. He was an actor who would basically be playing the role. So he'd be faking that he was in this experiment, and he was actually also going to fake everything that happened to him in this experiment. So the teacher is the experimentee, the person the experiment is actually being done on, although he thinks that it's being done on the learner. And so what they're supposed to do is that they are supposed to basically teach these word associations to the learner. But when the learner gets it wrong, he gets an electric shock. And the teacher's role is to basically ask these questions and then then deliver the electric shocks by pushing a button. Now, no electric shocks were actually delivered. The teacher thinks he is, but the learner is an actor. He's in on it. He's not getting shocked. Okay? But the teacher doesn't know that. So these shocks gradually increased in various levels, up the way to 450 volts, which is labeled XXX, fatal dose, Okay, and the rules were that the experiment is suspended after 3 top voltages so the experiment is done when 3 top level voltages are delivered, or the experimentee asks to stop 4 times. When the teacher asks to stop, they have 4 specific verbal prods they deliver. Please continue, or please go on. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. So, and they are delivered in this order. As you can see, they are more forceful. So the question is, what percentage of people went all the way and delivered that fatal dose? And the answer is the most depressing thing you will have ever seen. 65% of people administered the experiment's final massive 450-volt shock. 26 of 40. Subjects were uncomfortable doing so, displaying varying degrees of tension and stress. These signs of sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their hands, groaning, and digging their fingernails into their skin, and some were even having nerving laughing fits or seizures. 14 of the 40 subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughing or smiling. Every participant paused the experiment at least once to question it. Most continued after being assured by the experimenter. Some said they would want to refund the money they were paid for participating, which was the equivalent of about 35 bucks in today's money. Now, these results are extremely contentious. This is not like, this is a 40-person sample size of certain, people, primarily white men. So, not exactly a representation of every single person. White American men, I should say, okay, specific in a specific area, geographic area, right? That's another thing about psychology experiments. You have to know what the sample sizes consists of and why replication is so important. So there have been, and because of this, there have been a redunculous number of replications of the experiments, and you can read through this page. It is fascinating. And so even occasionally, like in modern times, in 2009, somebody got approval to modify the experiment and make it so that it was consistent with IRBs. Because obviously, if you think you just shocked a person to death, that could be a bit damaging to your psyche, even if it turns out later to have been fake, right? But yeah. So this is his most famous experiment. And it is one of the two things, if you take a psychology course, you'll learn about. Milgram, basically the infamous experiments, the Milgram shock experiment and the Stanford prison experiment. But what I really want to focus on is the other experiment he did, which is the small world experiment. That is essentially the experiment that we get the 6th degree of Kevin Bacon came from. Now, this is his more famous experiment. Sorry, his less famous experiment, but it's about social networks. And the idea here is that this experiment is often associated with 6 degrees of separation, although it was not developed by Milgram himself. And the idea here is that the experiment worked like this. They wanted to measure basically how extensive human social networks were, essentially, or how long it took things to travel. So what they did is they recruited complete randos in Nebraska and in Omaha, Nebraska, and Wichita, Kansas. Okay, complete randos there, and they recruited one stockbroker in Boston. The objective is that basically they sent a bunch of envelopes and instructions to each of these people that have been recruited for the experiment and said, hey, here is this stockbroker in Boston. If you know him and where he lives, send this envelope to him, right? Send this package to him. If you don't know him, send this package and send these envelopes and these instructions to the person you think most likely to know this person so that they can do the same thing in a kind of recursive process, right? You can see that's a recursive process. If you know the person, send it directly. Otherwise, send it to the person you think most likely to know this person. So you can see, like, here is kind of how that experimental path goes. Now, this experimental path, it kind of makes sense. Like, you might not know somebody in Boston, but these days, New York's a pretty big place. A lot of people go to New York. You probably know somebody in New York. You could send it to somebody in New York, right? And that person in New York, they might not know some stockbroker in Boston, but they might know a stockbroker in New York, right? Because professions, is another kind of way to match. And that stockbroker in New York might know not this person, but relatively kind of the stock, but he knows like a bunch of stockbrokers in Boston, and he forwards it to one of them, and they probably know this person, right? You can see how it narrows down considerably over these jumps. Now, a lot of these did not get delivered. They recruited 296 people, and 232 of these never got delivered to Boston. Now, part of this is because you were relying on people who were not initially part of the experiment, right? You would be sending it to a person, and a person would be getting this, and they'd look at this like, I got some of these, and they said I had to forward these to my, this letter to 5 other people in order for me to get rich. It's like it's an early version of one of those spam emails your grandma would send you, right? So a bunch of these got lost in the way just simply because of maybe non-participation, maybe because they just never worked or whatever. But of the 64 of the letters did reach the target contact. Among these, the average length of a path was about 5 or 6, between 5 and 6. So 5.5 or 6 is generally the way it's put. Hence, researchers concluded that people in the US were separated around about 6 people on average. There's a number of criticisms of the experiment, but it's pretty awesome. You've got the Bacon number, right, which is basically the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, which is basically this actor performed in this movie who performed with Kevin Bacon, so that person has a Bacon number of 2. You also have the combined Erdos-Bacon number. Players of the popular Asian game Go describe their distance from Honibo Shusaku by counting their Shusaku number, the degrees of separation through games the players have had. So it's a way of basically just showing humanity is interconnected. And let's see, network models and popular culture, social networking sites like Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram greatly increase the connectivity of the online space through application of social networking concepts. So what we see this though is that we can actually, now some researchers have formally, have done some more formal mathematics on this. And that leads me to one of my favorite computer science papers of all time, which is Kleinberg's small world model, which is navigation in a small world. Now, this is a paper that was published in Nature in 2000. It has about 2,000 citations according to Google, and this is and it's not that long. But let me emphasize just how not long it is by downloading the PDF. And this is the entirety of the paper. It is literally a piece of paper. It is one of the shortest computer science papers that is probably the shortest with the most citations, which is the way computer scientists care about measuring things. And the idea here is that he abstracted this kind of network. So with nodes and edges. Here, with node U, this node is basically, these nodes are arranged in a lattice, okay, a 2D grid, which is formally called a lattice. And they say, hey, so we'll pick a random node called U. Any random node in this graph has, these 4 neighbors, A, B, C, D, right? These 4 people that you're close to. But this graph will also have a random node V. Now, how we choose V is determined is the focus of a lot of his experiment and these other graphs, which is basically choosing the distance, figuring out the distance V should be. So weighting the distance V is based on a random distribution. So some funky math, and it's funky math because they're using Greek letters, okay? But the idea here is that, basically what they're trying to model is what a lot of ways humans are modeled. That you have a bunch of close geographic connections, but also you have like a random person that's all across, that's halfway across the country or the world, right? you probably know somebody who is like in a geographic area. If I had to send something to, if I had to send something to a random person in Korea, like via this small world experiment that Milgram did, the first thing I do is forward it to my wife, who knows somebody, who had a college friend who now lives in Korea, in South Korea, which is best Korea, of course. And then that person is way more likely to be able to find that person because they're in the same geographic location. Or on a personal anecdote, I have a friend, Dara, and she once went to California to interview it at Google, and she's like, I met another Jewish man about your age at Google who's also a programmer, and I was just wondering, and I'm like, Dara, just because we're Jewish doesn't mean that we know each other. And when he says his name is so-and-so, and I'm like, oh, yeah, totally. He was my best friend in middle school. So, it's the amount of people that it is always surprising to find the number of connections. And these small world networks are really important area of research for kind of routing. Now he found that basically now put this into actual terms. This paper found, if I'm recalling this correctly, that given here it is in the paper, right? So it's right there. Basically what he's saying is that what this paper says is that if you choose if your long links are chosen randomly, but randomly so that they're fairly good distance away from each node, then the average runtime to go from any point to any other point in the graph is log of n squared. O log of n squared. And this is, of course, assuming you have one long link. If you have, and there's other networks we've seen, the research has shown, and I've done some research in this area when I was doing my PhD. If you up the number of, this is with one random long distance link. If you have log n random long distance links, this only shrinks to O of log n, which is a lot more representative of the way that humans are. I mean, just for context, right? Just for kind of context, because we're dealing with numbers with our logs, they're about what, 8 billion people on Earth? Log, let's go with, so if we're gonna do with log base 2, log underscore 2 of 8 billion people. So let's see, 8, okay, good, it does it. 180, 800, 800,000. So that's 800, sorry, that's 800,000, 8 million, 80 million, 800 million, 8 billion. Log base 2 of 8 billion people is 32. That's not a big number. The idea that basically that you can, and in reality, it doesn't take on average 32 steps to get to any person. It takes, again, big O is kind of an upper bound. So social networks are basically show just how connected people are, because because everything does kind of in social networks does resolve into a small world network. Now, before I finish, I just want to bring your attention to one other kind of network that you will see that are also useful to know about. And I feel like it's important to introduce these things here, because when else are you going to learn about it? right? Graduate school is the answer, and you shouldn't have to wait just because you stumble upon it in graduate school. And the answer, and so this is what's called a scale-free network. Now, and the easiest way to kind of demonstrate what a scale-free network is kind of to just show you what one is. Here we have a random network with a bunch of nodes connected. In a scale-free network, though, note the very large nodes. Oh, sorry, the nodes that are grayed. And these are nodes with an extremely high degree compared to others. Most nodes, they'll have like a degree of 2, right? And a degree, remember, is the number of connections you have. It's the number of edges that are into you. But some nodes have extremely high degrees. Now, I suppose this does happen like in I think this does happen in human networks too. Like we all know that person who somehow knows all of our other friends, even though you don't know how they know all your other friends, right? We all know that person. We all have a person in that network. Sometimes we have 2 of those people. But these kind of networks are more common when we're talking about actual physical networks of computers. Like here is a picture of, here's like a visualization of the internet from 2005. It's a pretty cool picture. You know, it looks very like neuron-y or galaxy, but what we're seeing is that the lines, the brightness of the lines represent connections, and the brighter they are, the more connections there are. You can see this little zoomed in factor over here that we have this one node that has like a ton of edges connected to it, right? And it does actually make sense if you think about it. Like my computer here is connected to the router, but so is all of your other computers. They're connected to the wireless router. Our computers really aren't connected to each other, but they are connected to that wireless router, which has a whole lot of connections to it. And that router has connections to probably whatever's gathering the routers of, and then that goes to the ISP, and the ISP has tons of connections all over the place. So it is like a big internet connected world, and I do like reflecting on that as much as you know, as much as we can, and that basically that people have more in common. Although, you know, it is very interesting just to see that like you can get various aspects into computer science from history and computer science. So history and psychology can like even tie into computer science. You don't normally think of psychology and computer science being related, but boy, are they. All right. So with that, I just really wanted to, you know, share that story because I don't lecture too much other than my videos. But when there's something interesting, I do like to talk about it. So for the rest of the day, we will be, you are welcome to demo your labs or whatever else you need.